geologic time is something that, if you're not thinking about it day in and day out, it's kind of a concept that it's hard to wrap your brain around.
Rivers move, they flow, and they want to find the easiest place to go, and so they'll kind of find that, and so the patterns can change. And northwestern Missouri has a lot of paleo channels from previous glacial events.
So even in the largest caves, inevitably you're likely to be pushed down to hands and knees crawling or crawling on your belly. Claustrophobia can absolutely set in. It's something that you're probably mindful of before getting yourself into that position.
For me, geology has always existed slightly beyond my comprehension. For instance, the Earth is over 4 billion years old. How do you get your head around that? Turns out it took that long to create the geology that is always around us. Hi there, I'm Trevor Harris, and this is my podcast, Mo Curious by Missouri Life. The podcast explores Missouri's heritage. You can check out Missouri Life magazine at your local newsstand and MissouriLife.com. As I travel across my native state, I've always been a zealous Missouri-born rock collector. I gather fossils, stones with holes in them, and rocks that look worked. I've only ever found one real-deal arrowhead. That was on a float trip on Columbia's Hinkson Creek. Since moving to Kansas City, I've been gathering chunks of limestone. As housing redevelopment happens near me, what gets churned up in the process are the rocks that made the foundations of the homes of the city's affluent residents. These rocks are from homes dating back to the late 1890s and the early 20th century. I always ask permission before gathering the chunks of rock that, once relocated in my backyard, form weighty borders for beds defining plantings of yuccas and black-eyed Susans. Once dug from the earth, our rocks and minerals make foundation stones for houses, construction bricks, road cement and asphalt, phone batteries, gas for vehicles. The list goes on. As the bumper sticker says, if it can't be grown, it has to be mined. But just how did Missouri's geology get to be like it is? Well, that is the essence of this episode of Mo Curious by Missouri Life. Needing to know more, I sought out the experts at the Missouri Geological Survey. The survey's main offices sit just east of downtown Rolla. Housed in a 1950s structure built of Missouri stone, the survey employs several dozen scientists who concern themselves with the subsurface of Missouri. They name and classify what is there and advise on how to best use that stone to meet human needs. The Missouri Geological Survey staff collect and study rock samples. They measure for the presence of critical mineral elements, and they educate people like you and me. In the 1970s, the survey came under the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and today is among the oldest state agencies in Missouri. Amber Steele and Boot Pierce work for the Missouri Geological Survey. When I arrived in Rolla for our interview with the survey, they were ready. A copy of the multicolor 6x6-foot Missouri geologic map was laid out on the conference room table. Naturally, I requested a Missouri geologic oral history.
Well, if you look at Missouri, one of the things that you really notice first off, and if you look at the geologic map, you notice kind of this concentric bullseye pattern around southeast Missouri. The southeast Missouri, we're talking Fredericktown, Farmington, Ironton area, is what we call the St. Francis Mountains. So they're a volcanic core of the state. And then around that, kind of in concentric rings radiating out, is part of what we call the Ozark Dome. And that Ozark Dome, it's sedimentary rocks that are deposited on top of that St. Francis Mountains. And so it kind of gives it this bullseye appearance down there. The oldest rocks are right there. They're in Ironton area. They're volcanic in nature, so they're going to be granites and rhyolites. As you get away from there, it's dolomites, limestones. These sedimentary rocks were laid down later, much later, in an oceanic environment. The Ozarks end right at that escarpment between it's kind of a distinct line there. You drop off and then it's flat. We always like to say it's flat. You can stand on a brick and see Louisiana.
So let's take a minute to understand geologic time. Boot Pierce said the Ozarks feature the oldest exposed rock in Missouri. Okay, how old is old?
For about 1.4 to 1.5 billion years, there's been several successions of volcanics and then some later volcanics. So probably from about 1.5 to about 1.3 billion years ago, that was when most of the volcanics, kind of in that area. From 1.3 to about 500 million years ago, there's a big gap. We call it the Great Unconformity here in Missouri, because the sedimentary rocks that are resting on top of the igneous rocks are about 500 million years old. So we have about an 800 million year gap in time between when these volcanic rocks formed. Now, obviously, they're much deeper, but they formed. They get the granites get pushed up to the surface. When they get pushed up to the surface, they get eroded away, and then when they get eroded away, the sedimentary rocks are deposited later on there. So there's this large gap of time, and then most of the Ozark Dome is somewhere between about 550 million years old to probably the Mississippian rocks in maybe 350 million years. So for a couple hundred million years there, that's kind of the rest of the rocks of the age of the Ozark Dome.
Boot mentioned volcanoes and inland oceans as older forces that shape the Missouri landscape. Glaciers are a relatively recent geologic process that impacted the state as well. Today's glaciers exist mostly at the planet's poles and at higher elevations. Back between 2.5 million and 500,000 years ago, various parts of what is now northern Missouri were covered by ice that left behind loess soil and select rocks called erratics. Here, Amber Steele explains the types of rocks and their presence in Missouri.
Igneous rock is rock that's formed from volcanoes. And, when we talk to kids, that's one of the easiest ways to explain it. In general, 3 different ways that rocks are formed. One is sedimentary, so those rocks are formed mainly by pressure. Igneous rocks are formed by heat, so volcanoes and fluids moving through volcanoes. And then metamorphic, so that's heat and pressure. So you've got sedimentary rocks that form but then are changed in some way or transformed, metamorphosed into a different kind of rock. Most of Missouri, a big portion of Missouri is the bedrock that's underneath of us is either limestone or dolomite, and those are rocks that were formed in kind of shallow seas, and they're made up of ocean creatures that got compacted over time. And most counties in Missouri have some sort of a limestone or dolomite quarry, and we produce a bit of that in the state. It's a significant industrial mineral for us. And we don't really have any metamorphic rocks in Missouri other than some of the glacial erratics that have moved in from other places.
During the Ice Age, there were a number of glaciers that moved in, and we understand that they advanced and they retreated. And, depending on the temperature, and they came down, and then there were several events, and each time the glaciers carried material, and they carried it all the way from the Canadian Shield all the way down to Missouri, and then the glaciers stopped. So roughly where the Missouri River is, we understand that was kind of the extent of glaciation in North America and in Missouri. What we were left with was glacial till, so till on top of the bedrock, and following that, the winds kind of picked up, and loess was deposited on top of the till, and then the glaciers in Missouri are relatively old compared to if you go north of Missouri. There's much younger till. So a lot of the till that we have has been carved out by water, and we're left with hills that really, in some places, like the Sheridan River Hills in northern Missouri, kind of resemble the Ozarks.
Things like glaciers and volcanoes and plate tectonics and uplift have all had a role in shaping the almost 70,000 square miles that would become Missouri. The dirt and concrete stone we walk on all had its origins through some very geologic processes. The coal that powers your coffee pot was born of deposition and pressure. The lead that fuels the battery in your cell phone came to be buried in the eastern Ozarks by the processes of deposition and then metamorphosis. It's difficult to comprehend the time and scale and scope of geology. When I narrow the focus to Missouri, my study becomes somewhat more manageable. Amber Steele and Boot Pierce, they're Missourians who've made geology their careers. I asked them to look back and share with me some influential moments that steered them to their career paths.
How did I come to geology as a profession? I was a little bit different. I remember liking rocks a little bit when I was a kid. I was always just enamored by streams and kind of stream morphology and how streams flowed and how you had swamps here and erosion here. I grew up on the Mississippi River. That's where it came from.
When I was growing up, I had an aunt she was an earth science teacher. She kind of inspired me to go into the field. She was awesome about showing me when there were rocks, and we would take a rock hammer and go look at things, and just kind of got me going on that. And she knew that I had an interest, and so I went to school in southeast Missouri in Cape Girardeau. That's kind of what inspired me to go into the field.
Much of what is known about Amber's field is summarized in that colorful Missouri geologic map. With the map taped down on the table in front of us during our interview, I asked Amber and Boot, with deposition and uplift and erosion, all this landscape activity is going on all the time around Missouri, are there any geologic wonders that especially stand out for you?
One of the places that comes to mind is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, where the Current and Jacks Fork River are in southern Missouri, in the heart of the Ozarks. And as a kid, I grew up kind of floating rivers with my family, floating the current, and have some really good memories of that. And then as I got into my career, I was able to do some mapping in that area, and it was just really special to be in there and getting a better understanding of the geology. It's one of the places where you can see where the Ruby Dew sandstone meets up with the Gasconade dolomite, and there are beautiful springs that feed into those rivers, and karst topography and caves, and it's just a really beautiful place. Lots of natural communities, and a lot of the mapping that we did was related to soils, and so you kind of had to understand the geology in order to map the soils, and that informed how land managers are managing the scenic riverways. And now today I like to bring my family back there and float the rivers with my kids, and it's just a really special place.
I'm kind of torn between two. I absolutely love Silver Mines recreational area down near Fredericktown. That is an awesome, awesome place. And then probably my other favorite, which is in on the opposite end of that spectrum, is probably Mingo Wildlife Refuge. Big swamps down there in southeast Missouri. Again, I grew up on the river and along there, so I've always kind of just really liked the swamps. And so I just love walking around down in there.
Walk around long enough in Missouri, and you'll find fossils. These are remains of, or an imprint left in a rock of an organism. Those discs, known as crinoids, they're familiar fossils, as are trilobites and corals. When I find a fossil, I often pause to ponder about the age of the creature or plant represented in the fossilized remains.
You know, you find a fossil and you can get a book and identify it. And, you know, when you talk about geology, there's a lot of niches within the field. And so some folks are interested in the fossils and paleontology, and that's what they go into. And then you bring in more of like zoology and botany, because you need to be able to understand what you're looking at, what drives geologic science in Missouri. It is driven by economics, and we're mapping along the I-70 corridor because we want to better understand how we can help identify resources and aggregate for road building and road construction. And so infrastructure is huge. Missouri has a long history of mining lead and zinc, and there's a lot of work right now being done across the U.S. to better understand critical mineral resources. And we call them critical because, you know, they are minerals that we need, that are in short supply for things like cell phones and electric cars and that kind of thing.
The critical mineral resources that Amber mentioned include things like cobalt. It's used in high-performance batteries, such as those used in the emerging electric car market. There's a company called Missouri Cobalt that aims to tap the estimated 35 million pounds of recoverable cobalt under Missouri. The company states that demand for cobalt was over $16 billion in 2019. While cobalt seems to be a geologic mineral of the future, in Missouri, it was coal that drove geologic advances here 100 years ago. Examine a map of coal potential in Missouri, and you'll see that much of the state is underlain with seams of that mineral. Where did all that coal come from?
Coal formed in areas that were swamps. We can think of them as wetlands now, and a lot of that was during the Pennsylvanian time frame, so more recent deposition, and those old swamps got buried and they contained a lot of carbon, and anaerobic conditions led to that type of material being deposited.
Pennsylvanian was a geologic time period occurring within the Paleozoic era, some 320 to 360 million years ago.
When I talked earlier about the Pennsylvanian being near sea level, and as sea levels rose and fell there, that rose or fell 40 or 50 times throughout the course. Each time that it would rise, you would create these big lush swamps. So then, the sea level would drop, and these, you've got all this stuff gets buried, and then the swamp gets buried with other sediments, gets compacted. With coal, there's other things that gets kind of deposited in that at the same time, and you get a lot of iron minerals and iron sulfides. A lot of times we call them pyrites and marcasites. As you heat coal up and compress it and compact it, oftentimes you drive those sulfides out of there, that sulfur out of there. And so we see that in places like Wyoming, where they have really, really thick coal deposits. They're buried, and they don't have the sulfur in them. So starting in probably the 1940s, and I think the last coal mine shut down in like the Macon area in the 70s. We began switching because we began seeing coal pollution, sulfur pollution from coal. So they switched to the coal deposits that have less sulfur in them. It's cheaper than coming up with the engineering, the science to get the sulfur out of the coal that we burn. The coal in Missouri is still burnable. It's still usable. It just happens to have more sulfur in it. At some point in time, it may be economically viable to burn that coal again. But right now, technology is such that it's probably cheaper to mine the coal in Wyoming, put it on a train, and move it to here than it is to try to come up with the technology to pull the sulfur out of the smoke. I remember my grandmother and grandfather, they had a little coal bin in the basement, and the truck would drive up, they'd run a chute over to a window on the side of the house and run coal down there. And in the wintertime, you had to go scoop coal and put it into the furnace. That's what they burned for heat. The coal bin was just black. The walls were black. Ceiling is just from the powder. Yeah, and it was pretty dirty. I mean, it was dirty in the basement all the time because you had the soot.
That was Boot Pierce from the Missouri Geological Survey, recalling how coal fueled his grandparents' home, leaving a blackened basement. You're listening to Mo Curious by Missouri Life. The podcast explores Missouri's heritage. Check out Missouri Life magazine at your local newsstand and at MissouriLife.com. On this episode, we examine our state's geology. When we talk about rocks and mineral formation, it's abstract unless you go out and look at those rocks. That's what Amber and Boot say is their favorite parts of their jobs, the days in the field collecting data and specimens. Part of their field includes Missouri's increased risk for earthquakes. Here, Amber explains why Missouri has an increased risk relative to neighboring states.
Missouri is home to the New Madrid seismic zone. That area, it's a fault. It's one of the few faults kind of in the mid-continent, so we know that two plates come up against each other in that area. Back in the early 1800s, there were a series of 3 major earthquakes. The system for measuring earthquakes has evolved since then, but we believe those to be 7.0 or larger. What we have left to better understand that is the sand blows. They say that the Mississippi River ran backwards. There's all kinds of tales about those earthquakes, and we've really not experienced anything quite that significant since then, but we know that that's an area where there's potential for earthquake activity. There have been earthquakes 4.6 or smaller that occurred kind of in the 90s and early 2000s. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know when. So that I think it's a good topic to bring up because there are steps that we can take to be prepared for an earthquake and understand the risk that you have a plan, have supplies, and yeah, Missouri is definitely a little bit more at risk along with some of the surrounding states in the Boot Heel area.
To best prepare for a possible earthquake, the geologist Amber Steele suggested you lay in a 3-day supply of water for everyone in the house, plenty of easily prepared food, a flashlight with working batteries, and a weather radio. Think about your pet's needs too. Earthquakes are a geologic phenomena that has a higher potential in Missouri. The conversation about them is a reminder that, oh yeah, we Missourians live in a geologically active place. Most of the time, we think little about our subsurface strata of rock layers resting quietly, one on top of the other. As we heard, limestone and dolomite created from inland ocean depositions lie near much of Missouri's surface. As rainwater percolates through these sedimentary layers, it picks up minerals that can dissolve bedrock. Caves are those caverns that form from subterranean erosion over eons. Caves, like earthquakes, are geology in action. The Department of Natural Resources counts 6,300 known caves under the state of Missouri. Caves are of interest to geologists like Amber and Boot and to speleologists. That's someone who studies and may even map caves. Much of what is known about the geology of caves comes from the work of volunteer mappers, folks like Dan Lamping. He's the volunteer president of the Missouri Speleological Survey. I met the Melville High School civics teacher at the gated mouth of Cliff Cave, that's in St. Louis County. Less than a half mile from the Mississippi River, the cave opening is an impressive 12 feet high and 30 feet across. It's a favorite local destination for the veteran speleologist.
I grew up in Jefferson County, Missouri, where there's an abundance of caves, and growing up in Missouri, I got involved in organized caving probably 20 years ago. A friend asked me if I wanted to go to a party, and it wound up being a weekend-long camp out with a few hundred cavers. I became sort of exposed to this little subculture of people who are interested in caves and cave exploration, and immediately became hooked and realized that these were my people, so to speak. Got involved in organized caving, joined a grotto here in St. Louis, which is a caving club. Pretty early on, I got involved in cave mapping and surveying and documenting, doing original exploration, and that was a bit of a game changer in terms of my level of involvement and commitment. This cave, Cliff Cave, is owned by St. Louis County Parks Department. The first thing that we would have to do is get permission from them. And I've got a really good working relationship with the St. Louis County Parks. And in this particular cave, actually, I've taken a lot of students that I've taught over the years into here to do graffiti removal. You can see the outside of this is covered in bright spray paint. And inside of here was, up until I started taking students here maybe 6-7 years ago. There's been a lot of high school kids that have come in here and scrubbed away at this, and the graffiti goes quite a ways back there. In this particular cave, the passage stays this dimensions and actually opens up and gets a little bit bigger for a little ways. There's a waterfall further on up ahead. After about 700 feet to 1,000 feet, it pinches down to low, hands and knees crawling, and gets down to where you would be crawling on your belly in a stream. So you'd full immersion in the water. In that as well, there's mineral deposition that occurs where minerals like calcite can deposit to create what most people recognize as stalactites or stalagmites and flowstone and sort of a wide range of what we call speleothems that are secondary mineral deposits in caves that give them some incredibly beautiful appearances and unique character. to get involved in caving and cave mapping and original exploration, you've got to be the right kind of wrong to enjoy it and to want to push yourself to that point. But inevitably, everybody has a point where they may be pushing the boundaries of their comfort level. Claustrophobia has probably hit in a few times where it's a short burst of panic and you calm yourself down. You can easily be overheated. You may have to physically exert yourself, for a period to get through a tight squeeze, and you've got all of this heavy clothing on. That overheating combined with your chest being compressed to the floor and your back being compressed up against the ceiling, it compounds. And for me, at least, the natural reaction has been a brief burst of panic, and then it's having to take a couple breaths, calm down, and realize that the more you fight it, the more problems you may create for yourself, and move slowly and methodically, and haven't gotten myself into anything yet that I couldn't get out of. The longest time I've spent underground, from the point of entry to leaving the cave, exiting it, was 7 consecutive days. So that's camping underground, because where you're mapping at is so far and remote that the travel time and the difficulty of travel eats up much of the time. So you exert the effort to get there, and then once you're there, if the conditions are right that allow for it, and then you may stay there for a few days and map for multiple days. That's not the norm. A typical cave mapping trip is usually going to be at least 8 hours long. It may be over 20 hours long. The trip may end for a variety of reasons. Mapping caves is a slow process. It's easy for cold to sit in. It may be that the cave passage ends and it gets too tight that we can't continue on any further. It may be that the sketcher, the person who's drawing out the cave passages, winds up hitting burnout and just can't really continue working any further.
And it is then that a cave mapping trip comes to an end. The geologic unknown remains unknown for a little while longer. Whether you think of it or not, geology is everywhere. It's always under us. As rock, of course, it's also seen in the soils in which we garden. These soils were derived from earlier erosion and nutrient deposition. That cement on which we drive and bike and walk and wheel comes from crushed stone. The bricks from which we build our homes come from clay, once buried in the earth. The gravel covering Missouri's country roads often originates as much larger rock dug and crushed than nearby quarry. Geologic processes, albeit not much of it in Missouri. Limited accessibility to oil and gas in Missouri has spared our state much of the negative environment impact found in neighboring states like Oklahoma, states that feature large-scale fracking operations and subsequent earthquakes. Soil, sand, brick, gravel, gasoline are some of the things we get from the earth. Realities surround us. To better understand the lives of our state, I documented Missouri Geological Survey papers. I'm Trevor Harris, and we are listening to Curious about Missouri. The podcast explores Missouri's heritage. Check out Missouri any local news feed, Missouri Life. Curious podcast is a project of my business, the Recollection Agency. Our local folks to preserve their stories that were edited into a CD or DVD. Learn more about the business and hear field notes by audio blog at recollectionagency.com. Until next time, stay curious.